Hello everyone and welcome to the TMF Reference Model, It Doesn't Have to Be Scary, presented by Roe. I'm Damian Gardy, I'm an editor with Fierce Markets Life Sciences Publications, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Kristen Snipes, a project director at Roe, and Missy Lavinder, a senior project manager at Roe. You can read their full bios on the right side of your window. And just a couple of technical notes before we start. If you have any trouble reading a slide, please hold and drag the right corner of the slide window to enlarge it. And please also disable your pop-up blocker to participate in the interactive parts of this presentation. And we'll follow the presentations with a Q&A session, so please submit your questions during or after the presentations using the Q&A box at the right side of your window. And that's it. Okay, now let's begin. Kristen, please go ahead.
Thanks, Damian. So welcome, everybody. We're excited to be here today. Recently, Roe implemented the TMF Reference Model. So for the presentation today, we're going to be reviewing some background on the reference model, just to do some level setting. So for those of you who are familiar with the reference model and have visited the DIA website, some of this information should look familiar to you. For those of you who aren't as familiar, we definitely encourage you to go to the DIA website and look at their electronic document management corner. There's a lot of great material there, and we have found it very helpful in educating our staff and taking us through this process. So following that background, we're going to review some steps for implementation, and then we're going to follow with a brief case study and some lessons learned as we've moved through this process. So first, we're going to just discuss what is the trial master file in general, and it is the collection of content that allows the evaluation of the conduct of the clinical trial. The integrity of the data and compliance of the trial with all regulations, GCP and local regulations. And this is not only documents. I think a lot of people kind of fall short in that they think that this is just solely documents, and it can be programs that are created in support. There are references within ICH guidelines, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. These are just a subset of the documents that you're likely creating and programs that you're likely creating in support of the work that you're doing. And overall, if this is not managed well, it could misrepresent the work that your company is doing at the time of an audit. And so everybody works really hard as you're running these clinical studies, and you want to make sure that that is reflected in the trial master file. Okay, so let's talk about the TMF process as it stands right now for many pharma companies and CROs, and some of the potential findings that we're seeing and some of the current problems. Some of the recent findings that have been spotlighted are that the TMF content is held in multiple locations. And so what this means for many of us is that you have sponsors that have portions of the trial master file, CROs who are holding some of the study-specific files, potentially central laboratory vendors, and IP vendors who are holding just sections of your file. And so the consistency of the documentation and how you're naming it and the accessibility of those documents as well as the quality of those documents are hard to maintain when it's physically housed in multiple locations during the study. This can lead to an incomplete TMF. And so the multiple physical locations can cause documents to not be collected in a timely manner. And also, an incomplete TMF can be caused by the fact that at most companies, or at some companies, there's a misconception that only clinical or project management is responsible for the trial master file. And we found that if you feel like clinical or PM are solely responsible, then that is definitely going to lead to a poor quality TMF. Another finding is that there are differences among internal functions on the management of the TMF. So this means that maybe one of your group is sending down documents hard copy to the trial master file, but another group would be saving them on a shared drive somewhere, or one project team is requiring original signatures of a document, but another is allowing for scanned or copies of signatures. So that consistency within your company is also something that needs to be represented in your TMF management. Another issue is if you are trying to fit your structure and process into another company's structure and process, there can be disparity in the transfer, and so this could lead to to an incomplete or a poor quality trial master file. And then a lot of findings are surrounding waiting to the end of the study to perform quality or reviews for completeness. And I think a good example of this that we have heard, or that we have seen, is like, if you have a trial master file that maybe, let's say, includes about 400 documents, but then 350 of those documents are submitted the week before an audit, this can be a finding for your company. So that sort of fire drill at the end is an issue. So what happens during regulatory inspections? What we're seeing is that personnel are diverted from current studies to prepare for as much time and notice as you're given. So this distracts them from their current ongoing work. It increases the risk for quality gaps in their active projects because they're sort of having this fire drill to go to put the pieces of the puzzle back together for the trial master file to make it as complete as possible in preparation for the audit. During the audit, an inability to find documentation quickly prior to and also during the inspection can be problematic. If an auditor can't find a document or can't quickly navigate to it, then that can be a finding, because if they can't see it and they don't have it, then they're going to assume that your team did not have access to that as well. And this could relate to a hard copy document or an electronic document. And overall, this just leads to increased costs for your company. There's rework that has to be done, and there's additional time going back, and it takes longer to recreate something than it would be to maintain it from the start. So there's personnel time, which translates to financial cost, and also just morale for people that have to go back and feel like they didn't do a good job the first time around, or they're having to clean up a mess that somebody else made. Okay, so let's talk about the TMF reference model and how it can help us with all of this. It was not intended to be a regulatory standard, and as we noted before, the ICH GCP E6 is the backbone for the reference model. But again, this is a minimal list of essential documents that is incorporated in this section, and it doesn't provide the comprehensive list that we need for the trial master file management. So as a result, there was a very smart group of people that came together and said, we need a better reference for what should be in the trial master file. And so this team was composed of pharma and CRO and vendors and they created this reference list. And they released the first one in June 2010. And then all along the way, they have sought input from regulators such as the FDA, MHRA, and EMA to get input. The current version out is version 2.0, and I think that version 3.0 will be released this June. So, again, some examples that you'll see listed there are some of the documentation that we know are not accounted for but needed in support of a complete trial master file, and those would be data management and statistical methodology, documentations that you followed your process. If you have a QC review process for your CSRs, how are you demonstrating that review was completed in your trial master file? So items like that are not included in the minimal list would be reflected in this reference model. Okay. So defining the TMF, there's the minimal list of documents that are defined by ICH E6, Chapter 8. And then beyond that, there are additional records that are related to the study that you create that permit the evaluation that we've talked about in the instance of an audit. And these are the trial master file documents that we're talking about today. But in addition to those, there are other business records and other supporting files that are also used, and these could be things like GMP manufacturing, some vendor selection files for sponsors that you've reviewed and how you've selected your CROs. And these are typically considered outside of the scope of the TMF, but in the instance of an audit, they can be requested. So the TMF reference model also helps by standardizing some of not only the contents, but providing a standard reference of contents, but also naming. So there are standard contents listed here. It's the industry opinion on what should be kept in a TMF. And again, this is based on E6. There's also standard naming, and this is very helpful because, as we all know, we have a lot of acronyms that say the same thing, but mean the same thing, but are slightly different. So an example of that would be a DSMB versus an SRC versus an IDMC and a DMC. All of it means the same thing, but we use slightly different nomenclature to represent that. So a standard naming convention can help us level set on an acceptable terminology. There's also a standard structure that can support both paper and electronic systems, and then for those using an eTMF, there's standard metadata associated with the reference model as well. Okay, so why is this important? Why are we talking about this? And it's important because it helps provide consistency, and it helps give us all a reference and helps to set expectations across industry. So providing this consistency and giving us sort of a standard list for expectations can free our minds to also think more critically about in some of the other areas that we need to be focusing on during drug development. Completeness, it helps our project teams to have a complete list of documents that we would be expecting to see within the trial master file to more quickly identify what pieces of the puzzle are missing within the trial master file, and that is even at a senior management level. It also allows for ownership and accountability, and so this is especially beneficial for ensuring that content creators are submitting their documents to the trial master file in a timely manner. We all do a lot of work and put a lot of effort into each of the deliverables that we create in support of a project, but without the documentation, there's not really any proof to demonstrate that all of the work that went into that deliverable, that we met it on time, and that the quality is there. And audit readiness is a continual theme that you'll see. It's not the last time you'll be hearing this from us today, but that consistency and the setting the expectations helps ensure overall audit readiness and the ability to meet expectations during an audit. So the next thing we're going to do is kind of walk through just the general structure of the TMF reference model, and I'll start at the very high level with the zones and the sections. At row, we were already aligned, our trial master file structure was already aligned by functional area. So this really wasn't too difficult for us as a team. Our current structure was not completely off base for the reference model because it was based on E6 as well. However, one of our primary rationales for implementing the reference model was that we needed a more robust list and better consistency for our trial master files. And one example of this that I can give is that we migrated to RAVE a couple of years ago, and as we would do our internal audits, we would notice that some teams were putting down migration reports in the trial master file, and some were saving them in their project directories. And so we needed to ensure more consistency in how we were managing those migration reports and providing them in support of the QC that was needing to be completed during a migration to our clients. So the zone is the highest level of organization, and there are 11 zones, and you'll see, as I noted early in this slide, that they are somewhat broken down by functional area. And so you'll see the large groups here of, site management, regulatory, and those big pieces. Further narrowing that is each section. And each zone has at least one section within it. And some have a lot more, depending on the granularity needed. Then to further provide detail, we move into the artifact and alternate name, as well as the definition and purpose. And the artifact name would tell you the type of content that might be found. And so this, again, using our example of the DSMB, the artifact name might be IDMC within the reference model. But the alternate name would be DSMB, DMC, SRC, any one of the other three that I listed, or maybe you have another. So those would be the alternate names that would be equivalent to that artifact name. The definition and purpose we found very helpful as we implemented the reference model, because that gives guidance explaining the content that is being used in the content or use of the artifact. So this helped us as we had discussions with our different SMEs about what content we were looking for and whether or not it was created or if it had a different name other than the two listed here. So who benefits from a TMF reference model? Sponsors, we all do, is really the short answer, but sponsors can benefit because they are able to meet regulator requirements, and it's also beneficial to have similar structures when you're doing mergers or joint ventures. For investigators, it's beneficial for them because when we conduct our trials, we are going to be consistently asking them for the same documentations, referencing the same things, and calling them by the same names. For people like Roe, Central Labs, and other people that are outsourced by sponsors, using the reference model again provides us all consistent terminology and expectations around what documents we're creating, how they translate to each other's file structure, as well as just providing transparency on quality reviews and those items as we talk through trial management, TMF plans, and trial management plans. Technical vendors and TMF application developers benefit from the reference model because this is by and large the basis for a lot of their applications and gives them a good place to start for file structures. And then for regulatory authorities, having this reference provides consistencies across sites and sponsors, and so the hope would be that this will lead to more efficient audits for them and hopefully streamline approvals. So now I'm going to turn it over to Missy for the implementation of the reference model.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. So just to recap, we've reviewed the TMF reference model. We've level set some background and rationale for the reference model and the structure. The next steps we're going to take is looking at the implementation phase of the reference model. And these are really just suggestions of steps for implementation, and these are some of the steps that Roe has been taking with the implementation that we'll talk further during the case study. So your initial steps for implementation, the biggest take-home message here is that you cannot do this alone. It is a big endeavor. As Kristen's mentioned, the background and rationale and the years in the making of the reference model, it's a continual process, just like any process improvement. So you're going to need a core team identified to help with this implementation. And planning is key, as well as education and communication. So having your core team on board and educating them, just like we just did on the background of the reference model, why it came about is really important. It is very new to a lot of people, and some people are aware of it. Evaluating your existing structure and process, you're going to want to see where are you and where do you want to be. Evaluate the changes that need to take place. This will help you in your planning of your personnel and your resourcing, as well as financial needs. Looking at questions that need to be addressed and any gaps in your structures or processes. This is where you really rely on your subject matter experts and your functional leads within your organization. The way all this is done is teamwork and collaboration within your organization. Okay, so who needs to care about the implementation? Very similar to who the reference model benefits, who needs to care is everybody. I mean, ultimately you need to have buy-in from top down. So your senior management obviously is going to care because of personnel, resources, and financial constraints. You need people to have buy-in, and you need people to care and understand why. The quality assurance representative of your organization or your department is a key stakeholder, as well as your subject matter experts. And then ultimately, when all these people are involved, change management is a big key to success and looking at who needs to care and how this affects from top down and pushing ownership. So a little bit more into establishing your core team. This is very company dependent, depending on if you're a large organization or a small organization. It really doesn't matter your size. You just need to determine if you're going to have an executive sponsor or several champions. Are you going to rely on your stakeholders? And if you do, you need to make sure you have all your stakeholders accounted for. And this would be representatives from your different functional areas that can speak to different areas and have the level of expertise you need for the implementation. During this core team, establishing a scope of work and your goal for your project is critical. This will allow for buy-in and everybody to be on the same page. And then contracting with your team members. You're going to want to make sure that you understand everybody's roles and responsibilities, and if people need a way out, that there's a line of communication for that. Again, ensuring that people have buy-in and ownership will increase collaboration. And during your core team having these meetings, you're going to want to define a wish list or parking lot items. You can easily get derailed when speaking about the TMF reference model and all the implications of process improvement. So you're going to want to stay on task and have those wish list items separated for a later day. And then including your quality assurance group is key within the relationship of the team as well as implementation processes. So who is responsible for the quality and completeness of the TMF? Ultimately, you need your TMF content owner. They're going to be your responsible party. This is typically your functional lead within your assigned project. As an example, a functional lead within your data management group, so your DM lead, would be responsible for the zones that are on the TMF reference model delineated as data management, the same for stats, etc. So if the content owner has responsibility, what does that mean? Ultimately, they need to create the content according to the processes that are already in place, and this includes the filing and storage of the documents. And it also includes the quality checks that are done prior to, before, and after the inspection, which is always being audit readiness. So ultimately, the owner equals the responsibility and accountability of the TMF. So during the implementation and before you really start the implementation phases, you're going to want to ask yourself a few questions. Where do you as your organization want to be? There's some key questions you'll want to discuss internally. The TMF reference model is a very large document and it's very granular, and it's pretty comprehensive as far as any document you could ever imagine being in the file. So you're going to want to think critically of your organization. Do you want to implement the entire TMF reference model? Is that supported by your company structure? An example at Rowe is we've decided to keep the global requirements within the TMF reference model kind of as a hidden component within the reference model because we don't standardly do global trials. So those are just some examples of things you need to think about during your implementation. Is your TMF going to be a paper or an electronic TMF or a hybrid TMF? This will drive your processes as well as process improvements. You'll want to establish an approach for your implementation of the reference model. This meaning, are you going to do it all at one time? Are you going to have a phased approach? Again, this is very much resource-driven at your organization as well as your demand for need. And then ultimately expanding your core team. You want to make sure all the functional areas and any of the subject matter experts that need to be involved are involved. And this reaches out to technology, to QA, as well as your core project team members. Ultimately, identifying what works for your company and their business needs is key to understanding where you want to be. Okay, so now it's time to map your existing file structure. So if you don't have a current file structure, or if you do, you're going to want to take a look at the TMF reference model and determine, like I said, what meets your company requirements and what makes sense for your organization. You'll do the mapping exercise and assessment. And once you do have your assessment, you'll show You'll show that where there's gaps in your analysis. And some of these issues could be with location or storage or backup. It could affect company policies or procedures. So as you can see, it can have an impact on many different things. We found during our TMF reference model implementation, obviously a lot of the different zones and the granularity of the TMF reference model compared to the mapping that we currently had, there were changes, some downstream changes that affected our CTMS structure, the way we collected documents, the way we process documents internally. So some things to think about. Document storage was another one. Are we going to store them electronically? Is it paper? Do we have the capacity to store electronically? Do our processes support this storage of electronic documents, et cetera? And ultimately, there's resource challenges. Staffing, do you have the actual availability of the people, the time of the people in comparison to different work they're assigned, financial impact, as well as technology needs. So after you've completed your mapping, you're going to want to do a review of your mapping, and this is with your broader audience. And there's a couple different ways you can do this. You can do this via workshops or independent review. We actually did both, and we encouraged and required independent review prior to the workshops as well as after the workshops. The workshops, they require some prep work just to make sure everybody's familiar with the reference model, and they come in to have a collaborative, productive meeting. We did enforce participation. Again, this is where your senior management buy-in from the top down, knowing that it's a company initiative and having that buy-in for people that are attending the meeting. Your message setting across a wider audience and getting that buy-in and steering the discussion. Again, during the workshops, we found it very helpful, too, to have the wish list or the parking lot items. There was lots of great things to have, but we really needed to focus on getting the mapping done, and then the process improvements will come thereafter, and those were all put on the wish list or the parking lot items. And then in addition to the workshops, you're going to want to have independent review, and this is an ongoing process. Getting buy-in from your functional areas for your lead to know what needs to be in the TMF and what their area is responsible for is key. So this needs to happen before the workshops, after the workshops, prior to implementation, during implementation, and after implementation. So this was a critical step. So after your mapping is done and you've had your review of your mapping, you're going to bring it back to your core team that was identified in the very beginning of your implementation stages, and they're going to review the mapping and triage any questions, ensure that we've filled gaps and there's consistency across the maps. There are going to be a number of follow-up items and questions that are going to come up during your workshops, so all that needs to be followed up on, and we found it beneficial to bring back to the core team to triage those questions. And then ultimately, if you've parsed out the TMF reference model into different zones per your functional areas, you're going to want to consolidate all that back to one final TMF structure. And then once you have your structure done, that is definitely a big piece of the iceberg, but there's things to think beyond the structure. So you're going to think about implications of the reference model. Are you going to require original signatures? What are you going to require original signatures for? How's that going to be documented? Are they going to be stored electronically or paper? How are you going to deal with correspondences? I know this is everyone's favorite topic, defining what a pertinent correspondence is. Are you going to keep emails electronic? Are you going to print them? So there are a lot of downstream questions that will come as far as your process improvements once your reference model is implemented. And then having your quality representative as part of this process, this is a recurring theme throughout the TMF reference model, is keeping them part of the team. They will help some derailment and people going down different rabbit holes that maybe aren't going to get, they're not going to have any positive improvement on your processes. So keeping them involved is very helpful. Okay, so next is your sanity check. You're going to want to do some checks and balances to make sure what you've said you're going to do has been done. So your consolidation is mapping, your mapping is done. Now you just need to kind of sit back and take a breath and reevaluate. You need to determine if your goals were met. Was anything missing? Did we eliminate documents? Was it documented? And then obviously provide the communication to the projected team and set clear expectations. So now it's time for your final rollout of your presentation and gaining approval for next steps. So you roll out to your larger team. You've kind of filled any gaps or holes within your reference model that you've identified during your workshops and your collaboration after the workshops. You roll this out to your larger team for final input and kind of a speak now or forever hold your peace. So you have the final product to the team. You don't identify any additional issues or big gaps in processes or procedures, and you have buy-in. Now it's time for you to present to your senior management to get final buy-in from them. Again, as I'd mentioned earlier, this is definitely an ongoing process that you're going to want to report up to during this whole phase of the implementation. You're going to want to give them some step-by-step progress updates on where you are. You'll be talking to them about resources or reevaluating during the process. But you'll want to kind of give them the final output of the reference model product and discuss next steps. Okay. And in summary, change management is definitely kind of a buzzword that Chris and I both have learned throughout a lot of this implementation of the reference model. And we didn't really understand how critical it was in the process, but it was definitely, and it will be throughout the ongoing process of the implementation stages. But education and communication is critical to keep the team informed, and that is your core team, your senior management, your larger audience, your company, training, etc. Updating the TMF SOPs as needed, and this is all going to have to be done for alignment with your reference model, and these are your guidance documents, your working practices, etc. And then ultimately understanding that, yes, you are a content owner. This was probably the biggest challenge that many of us face. You know, most of you on the phone are a content owner, and anybody who touches a project or a TMF is a content owner. So having kind of that change in thought and ownership is really important. And this ultimately leads to people knowing their roles and responsibilities within the TMF management, acknowledging that this is a lot of change. There's lots of new terminology. There's new nomenclature. There could be new systems in place. Acknowledging that it's hard. It's not going to happen overnight. And then ultimately reminding everybody of the big picture, that the reasons for us doing this is that the landscape is changing. There are different roles. There's different requirements, that these are new standards that are emerging in our industry. And then using your change management process, you want to continue to identify gaps and areas for process change. Reviewing the technology impact. As I mentioned previously, we determined that there was impacts on our CTMS system when we did different changes to our reference model. And that wasn't something we had identified up front, but changing your templates and your structure and your nomenclature changes that as well as your filing structure. How you store documents. Is it on project directories? Is it on local drives? Changing those directories and any budgetary impacts. And then ultimately assessing the SOPs and procedural documents that could be changed as well. And then last but not least, you're going to implement some company-wide training. This is going to be very similar to your core team training that you did in the beginning of your implementation. But now you're in a much better position to where you have a lot of support. You have your subject matter experts on board. They've been trained on the process. They've bought into the process. They've helped implement the process. Your senior management, your quality assurance, everybody is on board. So now you're training your company and educating them, very similar to how Kristen reviewed earlier on the TMF reference model. You're discussing any system technology changes and any procedural update or document changes within your system. Okay, thanks, Missy.
So the next thing we're going to do is just walk through some and highlight some of the implementation pieces that we found key at Row, and we'll focus on just some of the big changes that we saw within our process as we move through mapping to the reference model. Okay, so as I alluded to earlier, we definitely identified a need for a process improvement around trial master file management at Row. And we were also seeing lots of emerging discussions around the TMF reference model at the time. And we were also getting some requests from sponsors about the TMF reference model structure. Were we implementing it? What was our experience with that model? So in knowing that we needed to complete this process improvement and update our file structure, we started to critically look at the reference model and that standard that was rolled out. And so what we found was that we definitely needed to expand our content list for our TMF, and that, as Missy said, in evaluating the reference model, we determined that at Row we wanted to adopt as much of the reference model as we possibly could. And so we worked through those workshops and reviewed with each of the SMEs in our functional areas to review the different zones. Sometimes those zones included multiple functional area SMEs, and sometimes we focused just on a sole group. And we reviewed the reference model and our current file structure and mapped our documents with row-specific names to each of the artifacts. One of the things that we did that we all found very helpful was the addition of the TMF owner and the TMF content owner and the roles and responsibilities affiliated with those. Each item of TMF content has an associated owner, and that owner, as Missy reviewed in the implementation portion of our presentation, is responsible for the placement of content in the TMF, and they are also responsible for performing the routine quality checks on their portion of the TMF. And so that was a very large paradigm shift for us here at Row. Over the years, project management and clinical operations have been sort of the default owners of the trial master file. And so, as we alluded to, that can cause an incomplete trial master file because project managers and clinical operations cannot be experts on all areas of clinical trials. And so we don't know what we don't have, and we can't manage content when we don't understand everything that's being created in support of that. So, for example, it may be that we don't understand that we're missing a DM document because we did not create that, and don't understand that document is supporting a QC or a review of manual listings and things like that to demonstrate that that review was complete. And the addition of the TMF owner helps ensure that that accountability is transferred to the person who is creating content and knows what should be down there to demonstrate the work performed. So we did review. Planning is critical as you move through this. So you want to go ahead at the start, as we've said, and what we did was review our existing SOPs, and we worked with a consultant to help us. We knew that we needed some additional support outside of our core group to kind of help us along the way. And so we reviewed our existing SOPs and had a gap analysis performed to highlight the areas of TMF management that we knew needed some augmentation. And we also looked at the type of TMF. One of the things that we found was that our SOPs were written for paper, but we really did have a hybrid TMF. And so we needed to update our procedural documents to reflect that as well. We updated process documents to help with TMF management. Initially, the TMF management was part of our project management plan, but we understood the importance of breaking that out and making it clear how documents were going to be managed, how we were going to demonstrate quality reviews. And so a standalone project TMF management plan was created. We also went back after we completed the mapping, as Missy alluded to, some of these downstream activities that we did, which were we needed to go back into our CTMS system and update the file structure. We also needed to make sure that the TMF documents that we now have added to our file structure are also reflected in the procedural documents and SOPs for the other functional areas. In addition to that, we needed to do a technology review to assess files that we were saving for internal purposes and reference, and how we were managing those as a part of this process as well. So the next thing will be just some lessons learned that we had through this process.
Okay, so this is the fun part. Now we get to go back and think about all the lessons learned and things we could have done better, or some good feedback for you guys who are looking to implement a TMF reference model. So if at all possible, when possible, we would definitely encourage you to do a pressure test of your new structure before rolling it out. So doing a pilot run, a dry run, whatever you want to do at your company, just to try to see what's working within the new reference model structure, what's not, is something missing. And this may be just rolling it out to a different group or a larger group to do that pressure test. The next lesson learned is even when you think that you're done, you're really not. As I mentioned earlier, this is an iterative process where it's a continual learning. As Kristen mentioned, we're right now on version 2 of the TMF reference model. It's our understanding that version 3 will be coming out June of this year. So as things are being added to the TMF reference model and the standards are changing, there's always improvement within the documentation. So it's an ongoing process for evaluation that's needed. And then the third lesson learned, which is probably our biggest, is that the change management was key, and this was within a lot of our lessons learned and kind of the key language that we've learned. And we participated in the TMF Summit of January of this year, and this was definitely a take-home message, was that about change management. And then whatever you do, do not give the Excel workbook to your subject matter experts without any education. They definitely will not think this is as fun as you do as being a TMF functional expert. So just really think about that before you provide people with Excel workbook. It is definitely overwhelming, and this is available on the DIA website. But unless you really know the structure or what the different zones or artifacts mean, people will zone out.
So educate, 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 and as Missy said, change management is key. Can't emphasize that enough. Even as you're working with your core team and your sort of larger team of subject matter experts, you still need to continue to educate the broader group as to what's going on behind the scenes, because if you just sort of come out at the end after you've been working on this and living and breathing the mapping and all of these changes, and then say ta-da to your whole company, it could be confusing. And so you want to continue to educate, and that is a part of change management along the way. Another key for us was to plan for resource constraints. We needed to make sure that in order to keep this moving forward, that we were realistic with our resourcing, the availability for meetings, and the work that has to be done to map this, because it's not just your core team. There's definitely a more significant burden on them, but as you push out to your subject matter experts who are working on projects or wear other hats at your company, you definitely have to account for the need for them to prioritize things above this. It's also the reason that sort of that senior management buy-in is helpful, where if you need a response, you can sort of help to get things prioritized as necessary. Which leads me to the next one, which is definitely get buy-in from the top down. This is not an insignificant process improvement. It takes a lot of personnel time and potentially resource if you're looking resourcing and technology cost if you're looking towards an eTMF solution ultimately. And you'll want to make sure that you outline, as we talked about, how you're going to implement the reference model. We chose to do this in phases and presented that to our senior management. And definitely involved QA. We had them as a member of our core team, and they are an invaluable resource. They're very helpful to kind of refocus when needed. You could also use them as a part of the pressure test to make sure that you're not missing anything. And you want to definitely make them your friend throughout this process. So I think that that's it for us for this presentation.
Great, yeah, thank you. So let's move on to Q&A. We got a lot of questions throughout the presentation there, and I want to get to as many as possible. So just starting at the top, how many unique records did you end up with in the TMF structure?
So I think that we ended up with, I don't have an exact number, but I know that we ended up with more than 350 in our final structure.
Great. And how do you decide what should be stored in the TMF versus elsewhere, like in a departmental shared library like SharePoint? For example, a UAT test plan and report may be stored in the TMF, but not other supporting documentation. How do you make that decision?
So this is an instance where Missy and I would go back to our core team or to the functional, to the SME for that functional area to talk to them about what we would need in order to support and document the work that was done. So, for example, the UAT test plan and support, if that is sufficient documentation to demonstrate the UAT was completed and successful and that the system passed, then that should be sufficient. And then the supporting documentation and test scripts may not be needed. But that we would defer to our data management experts to let us know what they felt like was required in order to demonstrate the QC and UAT process.
Cool. And what are your plans for transitioning to electronic TMF, and why not go electronic now?
Yep, so we definitely crossed this path kind of in the beginning of our implementation. While we were doing the mapping, we thought that it would be, we had the grand plan that it would be much more efficient to do all of this at once and go into an electronic system. And we are definitely encouraged to not go from one extreme to another. We had made a lot of leeway within our current structure that was a paper TMF, which now we know is hybrid. And we had pretty much almost finished our mapping within the reference model, and really determines if you have approval from your senior management and the funds to proceed with an electronic file. So we decided to complete our mapping within our current structure, which was a hybrid system, paper TMF. And then once we have all that finalized and process improvements, our plan ultimately is to go electronic.
Great. And you mentioned the importance of that buy-in when doing this process. How do you encourage buy-in by leadership teams and project team members?
Yeah, we found success with that. We've attended, it's been 3 years now, we've attended the TMF Summit. So 3 years ago when we attended the first TMF Summit, it was very eye-opening to some of the processes and the reference model in general. So we started attending some different web seminars and conferences and educating ourselves on the reference model. And we started getting requests from clients for our structure to be in the reference model. So we definitely saw it as an emerging standard within the industry. So we presented this and just made sure that our senior management was aware. As Kristen mentioned, we included our quality assurance group up front because they're typically the ones that are facing the auditors in the event of an inspection. That could be a sponsored client or FDA audit for that matter. So we just kind of made them aware of the industry standards and what we had learned from going to different conferences. And we really kind of kept them in the loop and got their buy-in from early on.
Great. And can you describe how you broke out the phases of the rollout?
Yeah. So what we did was, as Missy said, in speaking with senior management, we had identified that we had a need for a process improvement. And so we got approval initially for that sort of gap analysis. And following that, we broke out our phases into four. One, which was the TMF mapping, the implementation of the mapping, which also I think actually then was process improvement, the implementation, and then going to an eTMF was phase 4.
Great. And I mean, what lessons did you learn through that process, and what zones were the most complex or difficult to resolve?
So the zones of the reference model that were the most difficult for us, and Missy, you can feel free to chime in as well, was when we were doing the workshop, I think one of the more challenging pieces was around, I think, some of statistical programming and possibly biostats. As I said, for us, the understanding was that clinical and PM owned the trial master file, and so it was somewhat that shift of responsibility away from PM to kind of getting people to understand that they did create TMF content, they were TMF content owners, and that they also, that we weren't creating new work for them. This was actually work that they were already doing, and so kind of those were some of the more difficult zones, was the statistical and stat programming. And then I think with data management, I feel like it was kind of getting the artifact names and then what we called them at row. Sort of walking through that was a little more involved than some of the other groups where, you know, like I said, using that DMC, IDMC, we can kind of see pretty readily what we're speaking to.
And are you using a standard commercial software for your eTMF?
So we're in the process of evaluating eTMF vendors right now, and so we have not completed that.
Got it. And what were the biggest challenges and obstacles as you were getting started with the model?
So I think that initially kind of establishing our core team and determining stakeholders at the early onset and just kind of going through that initial sort of where are we, in my opinion, in establishing who we needed to make sure that we involved, and was sort of the hardest step because identifying everybody that was stakeholders in the process kind of changed along the way. And so we needed to look at who our core team was, and then as well as identifying our subject matter experts for the later stage, because you want to definitely keep your core team as, you know, as minimal as possible to help streamline your decision making and keep things moving forward as you do that initial analysis. However, that said, when you start to get into the mapping, you need to kind of broaden your group to those subject matter experts. And what you don't want to do is make it so big that you're inviting your whole company to join and give input, because you won't get very far.
Right. And the education piece, too, was critical. You know, we did try to keep it as small as possible in the beginning, as Kristen mentioned, but you really need to have everybody's buy-in. So it's almost kind of like recreating a training multiple times for different audiences was really important, and that maintains, you know, of critical importance, even going on with the implementation and even with the eTMF, et cetera, any process you do.
Great. So this next one will be our final question. We had a lot of great questions today, and I couldn't get to them all, but we'll be getting back to everyone who submitted a question personally after the webinar. So finally, with all the changes that occur during the course of a study, altering documents originally mapped as needed for a study, do you find it best to update the map as new documents arise, or complete it up front and change it as the need occurs?
Sorry, I'm just
updating the mapping. We have not had to update our mapping yet, and I think that's part of the ongoing maintenance of the mapping to determine, you know, to just keep. I think it really determines on the importance of the change. If it has a broad impact on your study or your file maintenance, I think you would want to do it sooner rather than later. Or do you want to keep a running log of different changes that need to be made and implement that quarterly? And that would fall back to our core team to roll that out. And again, we would perform the same type of education company-wide for those different changes.
Yeah, and with the version 3 of the reference model, we will be going back and reviewing that to see what we'll be needing to update. That's why it's important when Missy was going through the implementation that if you delete or if you decide to eliminate something from the reference model, that you definitely make a note of why you're not incorporating it for historical purposes, so that you can see and you're not having to reevaluate everything, and you can look to see what new was added and what you want to pull in. I think also our file structure is associated with our SOPs, so they're reviewed on a, based on our SOP review and working with QA. So they fall at least biannually for us here. So as Missy said, if there was a need to do it earlier because content was added, then we would expedite that.
Well, thank you for attending this first live webinar and for submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and Ro for presenting today's webinar. And this webinar has been recorded, so you'll be able to access the recording within 24 hours on the same page you used to register for the event. And thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.